Story 4, Part 2. The Escape of the American Frigate Alliance. From the pilot. Notwithstanding, the ship of the line was slowly sinking beneath the distant waves, and in less than an hour from the time she had fired the broadside, no more than one of her 3 tiers of guns was visible from the deck of the frigate. She yet presented an irresistible obstacle against retreat to the south. On the other hand, the ship first seen drew so nigh as to render the glass no longer necessary in watching her movements. She proved to be a frigate, though one so materially lighter than the American as to have rendered her conquest easy, had not her 2 consorts continued to press on for the scene of battle with such rapidity. During the chase, the scene had shifted from the point opposite to St. Ruth, to the verge of those shoals where our tale commenced. As they approached the latter, the smallest of the English ships drew so nigh as to render the combat unavoidable. Griffith and his crew had not been idle in the intermediate time, but all the usual preparations against the casualties of a sea fight had been duly made. When the drum once more called the men to their quarters, and the ship was deliberately stripped of her unnecessary sails, like a prize fighter about to enter the arena, casting aside the encumbrances of dress. At the instant she gave this intimation of her intention to abandon flight and trust the issue to the combat, the nearest English frigate also took in her light canvas in token of her acceptance of the challenge. "He is but a little fellow," said Griffith to the pilot, who hovered at his elbow with a sort of fatherly interest in the other's conduct of the battle, "though he carries a stout heart." "We must crush him at a blow," returned the stranger. "Not a shot must be delivered until our yards are locking. I see him training his 12s upon us already. We may soon expect his fire." "After standing the brunt of a 90-gun ship," observed the collected pilot, "we shall not shrink from a broadside of a 32. "Stand to your guns, men," cried Griffith through his trumpet. "Not a shot to be fired without the order." This caution, so necessary to check the ardour of the seamen, was hardly uttered, before the enemy became wrapped in sheets of fire and volumes of smoke, as gun after gun hurled its iron missiles at their vessel in quick succession. 10 minutes might have passed, the 2 vessels sheering close to each other every foot they advanced, during which time the crew of the American were compelled, by their commander, to suffer the fire of their adversary without returning a shot. This short period, which seemed an age to the seamen, was distinguished in their vessel by deep silence. Even the wounded and dying, who fell in every part of the ship, stifled their groans under the influence of the severe discipline, which gave a character to every man and each movement of the vessel, and those officers who were required to speak were heard only in the lowest tones of resolute preparation. At length the ship slowly entered the skirts of the smoke that enveloped the enemy, and Griffith heard the man who stood at the side whisper the word "Now." "Let them have it," cried Griffith, in a voice that was heard in the remotest parts of the ship. The shout that burst from the seamen appeared to lift the decks of the vessel, and the affrighted frigate trembled like an aspen with the recoil of her own massive artillery. That shot forth a single sheet of flame, the sailors having disregarded, in their impatience, the usual order of firing. The effect of the broadside on the enemy was still more dreadful, for a death-like silence succeeded to the roar of guns, which were only broken by the shrieks and execrations that burst from her, like the moanings of the damned. During the few moments in which the Americans were again loading their cannon, and the English were recovering from their confusion, the vessel of the former moved slowly past her antagonist, and was already doubling across her bows, when the latter was suddenly, and, considering the inequality of their forces, it may be added desperately, headed into her enemy. The two frigates grappled. The sudden and furious charge made by the Englishman, as he threw his masses of daring seamen along his bowsprit and out of his channels, had nearly taken Griffith by surprise. But Manuel, who had delivered his first fire with the broadside, now did good service, by ordering his men to beat back the intruders by a steady and continued discharge. Even the wary pilot lost sight of their other foes in the high daring of that moment, and smiles of stern pleasure were exchanged between him and Griffith, as both comprehended at a glance their advantages. "Lash his bowsprits to our mizzenmast," shouted the lieutenant, "and we will sweep his deck as he lies." 20 men sprang eagerly forward to execute the order, among the foremost of whom were Boltrope and the stranger. "Aye, now he's our own," cried the busy master, "and we will take an owner's liberties with him, and break him up, for by the eternal—" "Peace, rude man," said the pilot, in a voice of solemn remonstrance. "At the next instant you may face your God. Mock not his awful name." The master found time, before he threw himself from the spar on the deck of the frigate again, to cast a look of amazement at his companion, who, with a steady mien, but with an eye that lighted with a warrior's ardor, viewed the battle that raged around him like one who marks its progress to control the result. The two frigates grappled. The sight of the Englishmen rushing onward with shouts and bitter menaces warmed the blood of Colonel Howard, who pressed to the side of the frigate, and encouraged his friends by his gestures and voice to come on. "Away with ye, old croaker!" cried the master, seizing him by the collar. "Away with ye to the hold, or I'll order you fired from a gun." "Down with your arms, rebellious dog!" shouted the colonel, carried beyond himself by the ardor of the fray. "Down to the dust, and implore the mercy of your injured prince." Invigorated by a momentary glow, the veteran grappled with his brawny antagonist, but the issue of the short struggle was yet suspended, when the English, driven back by the fire of the marines and the menacing front that Griffith with his boarders presented, retreated to the forecastle of their own ship, and attempted to return the deadly blows they were receiving in their hull from the cannon that Barnstable directed. A solitary gun was all they could bring to bear on the Americans, but this, loaded with canister, was fired so near as to send its glaring flame into the very faces of their enemies. The struggling colonel, who was already sinking beneath the arm of his foe, felt the rough grasp loosen from his throat at the flash, and the two combatants sunk powerless on their knees, facing each other. "How now, brother?" exclaimed Boltrope, with a smile of grim fierceness. "Some of that grist has gone to your mill. Ha!" No answer could, however, be given before the yielding forms of both fell to the deck, where they lay helpless amid the din of the battle and the wild confusion of the eager combatants. Notwithstanding the furious struggle they had witnessed, the elements did not cease their functions, and, urged by the breeze and lifted irresistibly on a wave, the American ship was forced through the water still farther across the bows of her enemy. The idle fastenings of hemp and iron were snapped asunder like strings of tow, and Griffith saw his own ship borne away from the Englishman at the instant that the bowsprit of the latter was torn from its lashings and tumbled into the sea. followed by spar after spar, until nothing of all her proud tackling was remaining but the few parted and useless ropes that were left dangling along the stumps of her lower masts. As his own stately vessel moved from the confusion she had caused, and left the dense cloud of smoke in which her helpless antagonist lay, the eye of the young man glanced anxiously toward the horizon, where he now remembered he had more foes to contend against. "We have shaken off the 32 most happily," he said to the pilot, who followed his motions with singular interest. "But here is another fellow sheering in for us, who shows as many ports as ourselves, and who appears inclined for a closer interview. Besides, the hull of the 90 is rising again, and I fear that she will be down but too soon." "We must keep the use of our braces and sails," returned the pilot, "and on no account close with the other frigate. We must play a double game, sir, and fight this new adversary with our heels as well as with our guns. 'Tis time then that we were busy, for he is shortening sail, and as he nears so fast we must expect to hear from him every minute. What do you propose, sir?" "Let him gather in his canvas," returned the pilot, "and when he thinks himself snug, we can throw out 100 men at once upon our yards, and spread everything alow and aloft. We may then draw ahead of him by surprise, if we can once get him in our wake. I have no fears of dropping them all." "A stern chase is a long chase," cried Griffith, "and the thing may do. Clear up the decks here and carry down the wounded, and, as we have our hands full, the poor fellows who have done with us must go overboard at once." This melancholy duty was instantly attended to, while the young seaman who commanded the frigate returned to his duty, with the absorbed air of one who felt its high responsibility. These occupations, however, did not prevent his hearing the sound of Barnstable's voice calling eagerly to young Mary. Bending his head towards the sound, Griffith beheld his friend, looking anxiously up the main hatch, with a face grimed with smoke, his coat off, and his shirt bespattered with human blood. "Tell me, boy," he said, "is Mr. Griffith untouched?" "They say that a shot came in upon the quarter-deck that tripped up the heels of half a dozen." Before Mary could answer, the eyes of Barnstable, which even while he spoke were scanning the state of the vessel's rigging, encountered the kind looks of Griffith, and from that moment perfect harmony was restored between the friends. "Ah, you are here, Griff, and with a whole skin, I see," cried Barnstable, smiling with pleasure. "They have passed poor Boltrope down into one of his own storerooms. If that fellow's bowsprit had held on 10 minutes longer, what a mark I should have made on his face and eyes." "'Tis perhaps best as it is," returned Griffith. "But what have ye done with those whom we are most bound to protect?" Barnstable made a significant gesture towards the depth of the vessel, as he answered, "On the cables, safe as wood, iron, and water can keep them. Though Catherine has had her head up 3 times too." A summons from the pilot drew Griffith away, and the young officers were compelled to forget their individual feelings in the pressing duties of their stations. The ship which the American frigate had now to oppose was a vessel of near her own size and equipage, and when Griffith looked at her again, he perceived that she had made her preparations to assert her equality in manful fight. Her sails had been gradually reduced to the usual quantity, and, by certain movements on her deck, the lieutenant and his constant attendant, the pilot, well understood that she only wanted to lessen her distance a few hundred yards to begin the action. "Now spread everything," whispered the stranger. Griffith applied the trumpet to his mouth and shouted in a voice that was carried even to the enemy, "Let fall! out with your booms! Sheet home! Hoist away of everything!" The inspiring cry was answered by a universal bustle. 50 men flew out on the dizzy heights of the different spars, while broad sheets of canvas rose as suddenly along the mast as if some mighty bird were spreading its wings. The Englishman instantly perceived his mistake, and he answered the artifice by a roar of artillery. Griffith watched the effects of the broadside with an absorbing interest, as the shot whistled above his head, but when he perceived his masts untouched, and the few unimportant ropes only that were cut, he replied to the uproar with a burst of pleasure. A few men were, however, seen clinging with wild frenzy to the cordage, dropping from rope to rope like wounded birds fluttering through a tree, until they fell heavily into the ocean, the sullen ship sweeping by them in cold indifference. At the next instant the spars and masts of their enemy exhibited a display of men similar to their own, when Griffith again placed the trumpet to his mouth and shouted aloud, "Give it to them! Drive them from their yards, boys! Scatter them with your grape! Unreeve their rigging!" The crew of the American wanted but little encouragement to enter on this experiment with hearty goodwill, and the close of his cheering words were uttered amid the deafening roar of his own cannon. The pilot had, however, mistaken the skill and readiness of their foe, for, notwithstanding the disadvantageous circumstances under which the Englishman increased his sail, the duty was steadily and dexterously performed. The two ships were now running rapidly on parallel lines, hurling at each other their instruments of destruction with furious industry, and with severe and certain loss to both, though with no manifest advantage in favour of either. Both Griffith and the pilot witnessed with deep concern this unexpected defeat of their hopes, for they could not conceal from themselves that each moment lessened their velocity through the water, as the shot of their enemy stripped the canvas from the yards or dashed aside the lighter spars in their terrible progress. "We find our equal here," said Griffith to the stranger. "The 90 is heaving up again like a mountain, and if we continue to shorten sail at this rate she will soon be down upon us." "You say true, sir," returned the pilot, musing. "The man shows judgment as well as spirit, but—" He was interrupted by Mary, who rushed from the forward part of the vessel, his whole face betokening the eagerness of his spirit and the importance of his intelligence. "The breakers!" he cried, when nigh enough to be heard amid the din. "We are running dead on a ripple, and the sea is white not 200 yards ahead." The pilot jumped on a gun, and bending to catch a glimpse through the smoke, he shouted, in those clear, piercing tones that could be even heard among the roaring of the cannon, "Port! Port your helm! We are on the devil's grip! Pass up the trumpet, sir! Port your helm, fellow! Give it to them, boys! Give it to the proud English dogs!" Griffith unhesitatingly relinquished the symbol of his rank, fastening his own firm look on the calm but quick eye of the pilot, and gathering assurance from the high confidence he read in the countenance of the stranger. The seamen were too busy with their cannon and their rigging to regard the new danger, and the frigate entered one of the dangerous passes of the shoals, in the heat of a severely contested battle. The wondering looks of a few of the older sailors glanced at the sheets of foam that flew by them, in doubt whether the wild gambols of the waves were occasioned by the shot of the enemy, when suddenly the noise of cannon was succeeded by the sullen wash of the disturbed element, and presently the vessel glided out of her smoky shroud, and was boldly steering in the centre of the narrow passages. For 10 breathless minutes longer the pilot continued to hold an uninterrupted sway, during which the vessel ran swiftly by ripples and breakers, by streaks of foam and darker passages of deep water, when he threw down his trumpet and exclaimed, "What threatened to be our destruction has proved our salvation. Keep yonder hill crowned with wood, one point open from the church tower at its base, and steer east by north. You will run through these shoals on that course in an hour, and by so doing you will gain 5 leagues of your enemy, who will have to double their tail. The Alliance and the English 32." The moment he stepped from the gun, the pilot lost the air of authority that had so singularly distinguished his animated form, and even the close interest he had manifested in the incidents of the day became lost in the cold, settled reserve he had affected during his intercourse with his present associates. Every officer in the ship, after the breathless suspense of uncertainty had passed, rushed to those places where a view might be taken of their enemies. The 90 was still steering boldly onward, and had already approached the 2 and 30, which lay a helpless wreck, rolling on the unruly seas that were rudely tossing her on their wanton billows. The frigate last engaged was running along the edge of the ripple, with her torn sails flying loosely in the air, her ragged spars tottering in the breeze, and everything above her hull exhibiting the confusion of a sudden and unlooked-for check to her progress. The exulting taunts and mirthful congratulation of the seamen as they gazed at the English ships were, however, soon forgotten in the attention that was required to their own vessel. The drums beat the retreat. The guns were lashed, the wounded again removed, and every individual able to keep the deck was required to lend his assistance in repairing the damages of the frigate and securing her masts. The promised hour carried the ship safely through all the dangers, which were much lessened by daylight, and by the time the sun had begun to fall over the land, Griffith, who had not quitted the deck during the day, beheld his vessel once more cleared of the confusion of the chase and battle, and ready to meet another foe. At this period he was summoned to the cabin, at the request of the ship's chaplain, delivering the charge of the frigate to Barnstable, who had been his active assistant, no less in their subsequent labours than in the combat. He hastily divested himself of the vestiges of the fight, and proceeded to obey the repeated and earnest call. End of story 4, Part 2.